Hi, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this EPC online policy dialogue titled The G20 Global Climate Action and Geopolitics, What Role for the EU? As the title suggests, we'll be discussing the upcoming G20 summit, which takes place in just a little over 2 weeks on the 22nd and 23rd of November. And it takes place for the very first time on the African continent, more specifically in South Africa, which holds the G20 presidency. So we'll focus our conversation on the relevance and importance of platforms like the G20 for global cooperation, and also how climate action and environmental issues can be advanced within this framework, given the very geopolitically tumultuous time in which we live. And just yesterday, the UN published a report underscoring that nations are well off track of Paris Climate Agreement goals. And the report also explicitly called on G20 members to step up, as they account for 77% of current global emissions. And as such, they'll largely determine when global emissions reach net zero. So as such, this event could not be more timely. My name is Anna Crawford, and I'm a policy analyst here at the EPC, and I have the pleasure of moderating this panel this morning. And we're joined by an esteemed panel of leading voices in this area. So I wanted to start with some quick introductions of our panel and our panelists. So let's start with Céline Kauffmann. Céline is the Chief Programs Officer at the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations, based in Paris. She is also co-chair of the Think 20 task force on accelerating climate action and the just transition. So we very much look forward to hearing your perspectives on this. We're also joined by Vidisha Mishra, who is the Director for Outreach and Policy at the Global Outreach and Policy at the Global Solutions Initiative, which is embedded in the G20 and G7 engagement architecture, and is involved in its leadership and participation in the Think 20 and Think 7 processes. So we're happy to have you here as well. We're also joined by Philani Mthembu, who is the Executive Director for the Institute for Global Dialogue. The IGD is an independent South African-based foreign policy think tank, and the IGD is also co-leading the entire T20 for 2025. And given, as I mentioned, the South African presidency this year, we're delighted that you've taken the time to join us today. Next, we're also joined by Daniel Watershoot, who is the G7 and G20 coordinator in the European Commission, working in the DG for Climate Action, DG Klima. So it'll be very interesting as well to hear about the evolving role of the EU in these global forums, especially today and in the times in which we live. And finally, we're in the panel joined by Ursula Woodburn, who is the director of the Brussels office of the Cambridge Institute of Sustainability Leadership, as well as the Corporate Leaders Group Europe. We also have two respondents in this panel, so I would like to introduce those as well quickly. We have Daniel Wennick, who is the Policy Director at Orgalem. Orgalem is the European Trade Association, which represents Europe's technology and engineering industries. And we're also joined by Benedict Valles, who is Head of Public Affairs for OCP NutriCrops. So thank you all very much for being here today. And thank you as well to all of you in the audience for taking the time to participate in this discussion. Before we kick off, I just wanted to go through quickly some housekeeping rules. So the session will start with some 5-minute introductory statements by our panelists. And after this first round, I'll give the floor to our respondents who will share their reflections on what we just heard from the panelists and from the speakers, and hopefully also end with a question to the panelists at the end. And then after this, and after the responses from the panelists, we will open the floor to questions from the audience. So in the audience, you'll be able to ask your questions in the chat function, which you can already do now. So please state your name and your organization at the beginning of your question, and also who you're directing the question to. And yes, the chat box is already open. So for us to have as engaging a Q&A as possible, feel free to start thinking about your questions already now, or during the first interventions from our panelists. But without further ado, let's get started on this panel with some introductory remarks. So I'd be delighted for Céline to start. So Céline, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you for the invitation. I think it's a very timely event, so thank you. So you did a fantastic introduction of who I am and about IDDRI and our role in the G20. And so the few reflections that I'm going to provide here are really based on what we can observe as contributing to the G20, and I'm sure Philani, as co-chairing the overall G20, will have a lot to complement. So on my side, let me start by maybe mentioning that you've probably seen that mid-October there was the third G20 Environment and Climate Sustainability Working Group meeting and ministerial meeting, which is one of the outcome of the G20. What came out of it is mainly two ministerial declarations, one on crimes that affect the environment and one on air quality. And of course, from our perspective working on climate and environment, this outcome is relatively limited. If you look at the chair's summary of the Environment and Climate Sustainability Working Group, you can see there was a big breadth of topics under consideration, and in the end, not really a collective ambition on climate mitigation and adaptation, plastic pollution, or deforestation. And of course, the two declarations on crimes that affect the environment and on air quality, they are interesting in what they restate as commitment and interest, but they are not really a step towards more collective action. They recognize the issues mainly and the importance of addressing them. Personally, I'm not a big fan of language that is, restating existing initiatives or laws and that is marking the importance of a topic. Because it fits into the perception of some ineffectiveness of the institutions to really take action by just restating language. But it's still an impetus to keep the dialogue open. And in this particular G20, where we know that the geopolitics is a difficult environment, I think it's still a step forward. What was our interest, and what I want to underline is actually some of the key questions for, in particular, climate were dealt with outside of the Climate and Environment Working Group. And this is what, as the Task Force 5, we tried, and the G20, we tried to focus on. And let me actually mention two key topics that were and are being dealt with within the G20 that are of particular importance in our view to advance some of the climate agenda. The first one is obviously the question of critical minerals that features prominently among the 4 priorities that were set out by the South African presidency, which had as a priority harnessing critical minerals for inclusive growth and sustainable development. And if you remember, South Africa established an ad hoc task force dedicated to inclusive growth, industrialization, employment, and reduced inequality that is developing, in the process of developing 3 deliverables, among which one is a governance framework for critical minerals. The task force is also developing a set of high-level principles on green industrial policies. Just to mention that, in my understanding, the set of high-level principles on green industrial policies, which is short, very high level, is finalized in terms of the discussion in the task force, who will go to the Sherpa discussion. The governance framework for critical minerals is a lot more detailed. The discussions were much more difficult, but my understanding is that there's a draft now that is also going to the Sherpa. So in our view, those are two outcomes to be watched for in terms of what's going to happen in the Sherpa meeting and heads of state meetings in a couple of weeks. The other priority that we've been watching carefully at is the strengthening of disaster resilience and response, which was very set out as a priority for the South African presidency in terms of addressing some of the natural catastrophes that are coming out of the climate change. And we're here again, we expect some action and elements in relation to addressing natural catastrophe insurance protection gaps, which is an important and shared area of concern across the G20 members, and an important element we believe to address adaptation issues and preparedness to natural catastrophes. Of course, I'm not mentioning, but to us it's super important as well, the recurring agenda of the Sustainable Finance Working Group on MDBs and MDBs roadmap, which to us is a key element of the financing puzzle, with this year a specific output that came out of the finance ministers and governance meeting that was held, I think 2 weeks ago as well, which was the declaration of debt sustainability. So debt seems to be something that is advancing. So to us, even if it seems collateral to climate discussion, those are important work that the G20 continues to advance, and are important pillars to the discussion on climate, including in the run-up to the COP30, where the roadmap back to Belém will be an important discussion. And I'll stop here. Thank you very much, Anna.
Thank you very much, Céline. It's indeed very interesting to hear about the work that you're doing within the task force, and also the priorities as you see them in your engagement in this work. I would like to turn now to Vidisha. So the floor is yours as well for 5 minutes for your introductory remarks.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you, EPC, for convening this very timely conversation. Of course, the next few weeks, we're going to have many more of these, so it's great to set the tone here. It's always difficult to follow Céline because, of course, she set the stage quite granularly about what is happening in the task forces and within the engagement groups in particular, and what the progress has been over the last few months. I perhaps will take a step back and maybe take a broader view of the G20, also because in your introduction, you mentioned GSI, the Global Solutions Initiative, as being embedded within the G20 architecture through the engagement groups. We very much see ourselves as the believers of the G20 process, and have been trying to play the role of bridging the gaps between different sectors that are involved in this fora, as well as between the policy conversations, as well as the conversations that happen at the engagement group level and across presidencies. So from that perspective, I want to start by acknowledging that the legitimacy of the G20, or let's say the faith in the process, is being questioned at the moment. I think it is important to acknowledge that a lot of these multilateral fora are at the moment facing a crisis of trust, because a lot of people cannot see what actually comes out of the communiques in terms of a difference to their daily lives. So this year, no pressure to South Africa, but not only is there the pressure to make sure that there is this legacy of the 4 Global South presidencies, as we often repeat, that it is maintained, that they're able to consolidate and sustain that momentum, which is the T20 South Africa tagline, but also that the momentum is maintained across thematic groups such as climate, such as technology, that there are interlinkages between the conversations that have happened at FFD4 and that will happen at COP, more so because the next presidency is the US, and it's expected that it will be very inward looking, and a lot of the topics that we're discussing right now will perhaps not have the momentum that we would all like. So what is the role that Europe and other middle power economies can really play? And then, in case I sounded disillusioned about the G20, I am not. I continue to believe it is that one fora that has a vast majority of emerging economies, as well as all of the G7 countries. It has the EU, it has the African Union, so it has tremendous potential. We all often repeat that statistic about G20 representing 85% of the global GDP and 75% of the emissions. So where else, if not here, will we have the conversations that we're trying to have in terms of interlinking G20 and COP? But at the same time, we will have to work towards those proof points, however small, of what actually comes out of these task forces and the communiques and the roadmaps, which I have a lot of respect for, because I do see how much goes into negotiations. And as Céline was saying earlier, that specifically at this time, even sort of not backsliding is a victory in terms of the progress that we have made. So proof points can actually just also be in terms of consolidating a little bit of progress that we had made, as opposed to backsliding and going all the way back. So that is on the G20. To kind of move towards climate, so we have known for a while that climate and all of the associated issues, just energy transitions, climate finance, they're all sort of the litmus test of multilateral fora at the moment. If I focus my conversations on just energy transitions, because that is something that was repeatedly platformed by the 4 Global South presidencies over the last few years, how just energy transitions are inextricably linked to the development and growth story of those countries. I think that is important to kind of acknowledge that that remains a point of contention between Europe and a lot of emerging economies. So in order for the G20 to serve as a platform where progress can be made on those kind of points of disagreement or divergences, we will have to acknowledge that there is a difference in how people see just energy transitions in different parts of the world. The jet piece, of course, is an important step forward, but that again remains to be seen how it actually translates after the Johannesburg summit. When we talk about just energy transitions, at the moment, or climate cooperation as a whole, we can't really separate it from issues of geopolitics, which is very much in your title as well. It's become, the conversation on green transitions has become a race on technology, supply chains, and influence. So how will we tackle it? And I'm based in Europe, and Global Solutions Summit is based in Europe as well, but we do have to talk about how do we broaden the conversation in a way where Europe can have leadership, and there is a leadership deficit at the moment on issues of climate cooperation. We have to acknowledge how Europe can play that leadership role without seeming to put more walls up. So for instance, CBAM is something that is often repeated. They make sense domestically, but there are a lot of countries in the world and within the G20 framework that are not able to navigate that. So how can Europe play the role of climate leadership and that kind of believer in global cooperation and multilateralism, while also addressing some of these concerns that are there? And finally, I will hand over to Philani, who of course will have more of an insight on. I don't know actually, Brooke. Sorry, Anna, who we will hand over to. But I know that Philani will probably give a lot more insight into what happens in South Africa. But to my mind, the couple of points that will be platformed most likely, in particular in the engagement groups, because a huge focus at the T20, which we will all be traveling to in the next few weeks, is going to be on how to make sure that the conversations on MDB reform and all the many policy proposals and pathways that were identified, they remain consistent on the agenda. What happens in the US G20 presidency? How can we make sure that there is still consistent momentum when it goes over to the UK? What is the role that G7 France could play? Because at the end, G7 is a part of the G20 as well. So those conversations will be taking place in the next few weeks. And also, I remember Céline mentioning something about the language issues of how we're often in the cycle of diagnosing the problem and sort of repeating the problem statement, and in some cases also offering the solutions. but not necessarily making it very demonstrable how far we have come. So perhaps that is my the last sort of expectation of what we can hope to achieve in the next few weeks. Kind of interlinking all these global conversations that are happening at COP, FFD4, G7, G20, and to making this a bit more digestible and comprehensible to the wider public, so that we know that all of these processes are not in vain. We're actually working towards the greater good. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vidisha. It's, yeah, again, very interesting, especially what you were saying about, and your point of agreements with Céline about the importance of language, but also the importance of showing and demonstrating either how far we've come and how to get where we need to go. And as well, your points about the role and the tensions between the EU and emerging economies still, and how the EU can adapt to this changing multilateral forum. And I look forward to hearing Daniel's views on this as well in his intervention. But now I would like to turn to, as you mentioned, to Philani. And indeed, it would be great to hear more about your experience in South Africa and the importance of the G20 summit taking place in Johannesburg.
No, thank you, colleagues. I think, obviously, we know that this particular presidency, similar to the previous presidencies, is taking place in a time of rising geopolitical tensions. But also what has complicated it in this sense is that there is a particular tension between, in the bilateral sense, between South Africa and the US itself. And of course, South Africa has had to navigate that. On the one side, if South Africa pushes back too hard, it, at the bilateral level, it risks dividing, issues a lot more. It's had to learn to sort of walk a tightrope, learn to ignore certain noise, some of which comes directly from the White House and some which comes from voices that have proximity to the White House. So it's really had to navigate a geopolitical landscape. I mean, I argue, in fact, if that the G20 itself was actually quite fortunate that you had these successive global South presidencies, because I think that had it not been the case, I think the G20 itself would have been much more divided. And it took a lot of diplomacy to navigate, I think, these last couple of years within the G20. We've seen, of course, that even the US has not been participating in certain discussions, in certain areas, not sending, Sherpas, not sending, people to represent them in different working groups. But, there's been an inconsistency in the way in which they have been engaging. So in the concept note of this discussion, one of the fears is the US disengagement from certain areas when it takes over the presidency. But they've already been disengaging on certain areas this year. Despite that, I think South Africa has kept the door open to US participation, and rather than escalating matters, has consistently sought to de-escalate issues. I do think, that balancing act diplomatically has meant that South Africa has had to engage much more intensely with the other members of the G20. And to a certain degree, I think that has paid off. I mean, if we think about the issues around also climate and just energy transition, the US, I mean, South Africa had its own just energy transition plan and program that it's been implementing with partners from Europe and also the US. The US pulled out of that, and I think the US had committed close to $1 billion towards that. It pulled out of that. However, earlier in the year, what you did have was an EU-South Africa summit, which was quite important. And I think the EU sought to project itself as very supportive of South Africa's presidency, but also very supportive of South Africa's just energy transition program, and has even sought to fill, some of those gaps when it comes to funding the just energy transition. Now, this does not mean that there isn't an intense discussion and debate around the mechanisms of funding the just energy transition. You have stakeholders who say it's still overly dependent on loans. You have those who are saying you need to increase the grant component of financing the just energy transition, both within South Africa but also outside. And I think the financing dimension becomes important when it comes to climate change and the just energy transition, because of course critics are saying that much of the funding that is being made available, countries have to jump through hoops that they are frankly unable to. So, the accessibility to that financing remains a challenge. It remains a challenge, in Africa. It remains a challenge in the global South. And I think this is something that, South Africa has sought to elevate in the discussion. So it's really issues around the sustainable finance when it comes to climate change and the just energy transition. I think in sort of just wrapping up, I think it's also important to think. I mean, obviously there's a focus on the EU. It becomes very important to also say what role should countries we may loosely characterize as middle powers, what role do they play in upholding the key tenets of the multilateral architecture? And I think that is going to become very important going forward into the US presidency, because in an era where you have geopolitical competition, it's very important that middle powers are not sucked into that geopolitical competition. Of course, at times it's unavoidable to be sucked in, but there needs to be greater bridge building between middle powers in the global north and middle powers in the global south to uphold, the key tenets of a multilateral architecture. What South Africa is also looking to anticipate and planning for is, we know that Vice President Vance is going to be in the country. Now, that is something that is welcome in a sense that it's somebody it's the presidency that will be represented in the US. However, that is a double-edged sword also, because we know that when Germany held the G20 presidency in 2017, there are certain paragraphs that the US chose to not endorse, particularly related to issues of climate change and environment. And so this is something that South Africa also needs to keep in mind, trying to get the majority of the G20 countries on board, but also anticipating that there might be a strong pushback from the US, especially on issues of climate change and the environment. Let me stop there.
Thank you so much. It was great to hear such insightful remarks from the South African perspective. I think we'll definitely bring that with us throughout the rest of the panel, and it links quite nicely with our next panelist, which is Daniel from the European Commission. So the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Anna, and thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very happy to also share my experience. I've been in the G20 process for a few years now, leading the negotiation on climate, and I participated in the ministerial recently, and so I'm happy to share a bit of my insight into that process. But just about the relevance of the G20, let me take you 1 year back. You know, this day, 5th November 2024, it's when the United States elected President Trump. And at that time, all the G20 negotiators, the climate negotiators, a question immediately arose of what's going to happen and what is going to mean for the South African G20 presidency. And there was really a moment of questioning and what will the presidency do about climate, knowing that President-elect Trump had already announced that they will withdraw from the Paris Agreement and that climate was, again, a political divisive issue in the US. And obviously, for those who have been in the process for a while, there was obviously a question, an observation rather, that South African colleagues were adapting real time to this changing landscape. And it took a bit of time to take shape. The issue notes and the calendars were a bit later than usual, but when they did, when the issue notes were released, it was clear that climate and sustainability will remain at the top of the G20 agenda. So 1 year on, now we're leading to the summit, and I think they did, as the previous speaker has said, they've done a fantastic job throughout the presidency in navigating a tightrope. Indeed, but let me just make 3 observations as a post-mortem in a way. The first one is, I think that multilateralism work and the G20 still matters. And the second one is that climate and sustainability, and sustainability in particular, remains essential to the political discourse. It will remain central. It's not always by choice, but it's a necessity, and that we will have to deal with. And my third point is, in that landscape, and Europe has been and continue to be a key partner, I think, and in terms of leadership and showing the way. And if I need to unpack that in terms of the multilateralism, there was a questioning indeed whether the G20 will survive at all. Also, we're looking at the presidency next year. But it's true that they have been selective in, the US have been selective in where they have engaged, but they have engaged in environment and climate. And at the ministerial, we agreed, Céline said, yeah, there were only 2 joint agreements, but there were agreements with the US in the room. I think it's one of the few ministerials where the whole G20, including the US at the table, agreed on a ministerial outcome. And this is quite remarkable. It's on equality, on wildlife trafficking, but at least there was an agreement around the table. So indeed, the G20 remains the only place where we can discuss these interconnected economic, financial, environmental challenges. There is no other forum that gathers all these issues together. Secondly, I said climate and sustainability remain central because it's a fact that it's a reality that we cannot do anything against. There are droughts, floods, there are extreme weather events. You cannot really ignore it as policymakers. So even if the word climate itself is become a bit politicized, the reality is that we will have, as governments, we have to face that. And in a way, also, the timing was in our favor because the G20 used to be a place also where you negotiate. In the year calendar, you had the G7, then the G20, and then the COP, which give a bit the impetus for the negotiations at the COP. Now the negotiations at the COP are over. The rule book of Paris has been completed since last year. So in a way, this was a bit playing in our favor because the focus is shifting from negotiation to implementation. And the climate agenda in the G20 is not anymore so much focused on the negotiation, but more on the implementation, on what it means in terms of economic restructuring, on modernization, on industrial policy, on the development agenda. And I think South Africa has really captured that very well in the narrative for this G20. And as Céline was mentioning, including also in the task force, where the climate is not only about reducing emissions, it still is, but it's also about economic renewal, competitiveness, resilience, and development. And at the same time, you know, when the climate is indeed polarized in the US, but there is a more pragmatic conversation advancing from the macroeconomic perspective on the cost of non-action. There were discussions in the finance, on the finance track, on the cost of non-action, on economic opportunities, on the security dimension, and on partnerships, disaster resilience, as Céline mentioned as well. And from the business perspective, there's also a conversation going on scaling up clean technologies, on business opportunities, on grid management for electrification. And so there are these business conversations going on that are taking place regardless of the political landscape. And also from the welfare perspective, the need to accompany a just transition, managing the social impact on the skills needed for this transition, on the quality of jobs, on decent work, on health as well, where there are conversations also that are linked to climate without mentioning necessarily climate, but they will need to take place in the future. And finally, of course, as was mentioned as well, on finance and on the need to align the finance flows and on the need to provide finance. So all these conversations will continue regardless of the political landscape, and the G20 remains very relevant for those matters. And just to conclude on the role of the EU in that, I think traditionally the EU has always been as a bridge builder. We have a tradition in our own council to deal with different perspectives. So the G20 is changing, the dynamics in the room are changing, but in a way we are used to that because also in our council the dynamics changing. So we are used to dealing with this different changing dynamics. But throughout this presidency, I can confidently say that we have really played a role as a central role as the group, what we call between us, the friends of the presidency. We were fully aligned with the presidency priorities, and in a way we also, in terms of policies, we are already moved from ambition to implementation. And we have, as was just said, we have a very strong partnership with South Africa on diplomacy, on energy transition, on industrialization. So just to conclude, I think we will continue to play a leading role. We will make all our efforts to support the South African presidency as we head to the summit. And again, I would say we would really commend for the impressive leadership. I must say we were really impressed by the way the presidency has steered the discussion in a very challenging context. So let me stop here. I'm happy to take any question, of course. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Especially highlighting all of the different themes that you mentioned that are important for the EU in this year with the South African presidency, how the EU has been going about the South African presidency relating to finance, the scaling up of clean tech, just transition, and important as well, you highlighted the role of the EU, its historical role as a bridge builder, and it will be interesting to see if this label, if you will is how others also will see the EU, and I hope that we can touch on some of those questions later on. Building on what you said about the scaling up of clean tech, the business conversations that are taking place, I think that bridges quite nicely to our next and final speaker in the panel, Ursula Woodburn. So please go ahead.
Thank you so much. And of course, it's challenging coming right at the end. I have to say lots of points I agree with. So I've been writing a lot of notes that I'm slightly switching my points around here. But yeah, so I just wanted to say, so I work with a set of corporate leaders in Europe, but I've also been talking to colleagues of mine who sit in South Africa and have been working with corporate leaders in Africa and also with the B20. They've been peer reviewing a number of the B20 work streams on energy mix and just transition, industrial transformation and innovation, finance and infrastructure. And really I would emphasize a lot of the points that have come before this and part of the recommendations they have made as well. I mean, firstly, if we take the broader view when it comes to the G20, absolutely, we are in this much more politically fragmented world. And I think how we can really shift the G20 to being a forum where we can manage these global tensions diplomatically, how we can also work towards very concrete agreements around questions to do with infrastructure, renewables, sustainable finance, affordable finance, access to finance fundamentally. And, you know, in conversations with my colleagues in South Africa, I think it is absolutely clear that they have really shown an enormous leadership in this matter, but also fundamentally about shifting the discussions from being about just emissions, but also the development of South Africa, about justice, resilience, and finance, and to think about how climate and development should advance together and what the role of business and finance is in that. And I think there are a number of recommendations that I'll come to in a minute, but if you also look at what the role of the EU should be in that context, in this context where we have a huge continent and a huge potential for really interesting work on renewables. Africa has 70% of the world's solar, something like that, right? I do agree that this function as the bridge builder is incredibly important. I think you know, the EU has remained a leader on policy in many ways, but is losing elements of the narrative. I mean, I've been following the EU 2040 target discussion this morning, which, as you may know, has been agreed, but with some caveats, and also in terms of its NDC agreement, it's still in a range, but it does show that there is a fairly constant progress towards reducing emissions. But I do think that it has a lot of credibility in its policies, but it has been criticized for double standards. And I think moving forward, we need to work towards how we build genuine partnerships and investments, basically. And I think the same is true for companies. How can we really build genuine investments globally? And then we can really think about how we can cooperate on green industry, how the G20 can be a forum to cooperate on green industry, on finance, on critical raw materials. So we move from this declaration aspect to the implementation aspect that Daniel referred to really thinking about co-investment and shared value creation, from moving from a kind of slow and conditional support to true investments. So a genuine investor. So I think that these are some of the elements that we've been looking at. And if you really look directly from the business perspective, I mean, say from a European business perspective, or indeed a more global business perspective, I mean, absolutely access to finance is one of the really main barriers. How to make sure that we can put together real blended finance elements, strong project preparation, and build credible pipelines for investable projects, and how we can make sure that companies and countries, in a sense, can build this capital, technology, and know-how, but also think about how you co-design projects with local partners and convene partnerships, basically, specifically in coalitions around questions such as renewables and grids and climate risk data, food systems, and carbon pricing, I would say. So there's a lot, I think there's a lot of potential in these global fora to see how we can work together on some really genuine partnerships, and really make sure that we can maintain the G20 as an effective forum, rather than pitting it against the G7 or pitting it against the BRICS dynamics. When it comes to the finance aspect, I think the question around how the multilateral development banks can really assist in shaping the financial flows and in improving the access to investment will be really critical. And moving ahead, looking forward, obviously the outcomes in November will be very important. But looking further ahead, of course, we have the US leadership of the G20, followed by the UK. So I think it will be a question about how we bridge those conversations in the longer term, and also think about how we can reshape, if I'm looking from an EU and a business perspective, how we can really reshape the partnerships with the different countries in the G20, and think about how we develop true pipelines, right? And think about how we work on questions to do with adaptation, to do with the real effects that many economies are facing from climate change. So these are some of the elements that I wanted to raise. I mean, I feel like a lot of the other points I had before have been very well described. So I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think, yeah, indeed, we've been very lucky with all of the different perspectives and points that have been raised by the panel, and there's a lot of room for discussions and a lot of different points to build on. I wanted to now hand the floor to our two respondents who have the task of kind of giving their own perspectives in response to what we've just heard, the privileged position to do that. So. Yes, I wanted to start with Daniel Wennick. If you have any immediate responses to what we've just heard, or any questions or anything that you would like to build on in particular.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation. It was very interesting to listen to the panelists. So I represent Europe's technology industries, Orgalim, with 770,000 companies and over 11 million employees in Europe, and I'm policy director there. And a couple of points I bring with me here is on the EU leadership role, the role of business, of course, because I represent a business organization, and then on the ambition sort of going forward. First, on the EU leadership role, what I see is that who has the leadership role is, of course, also an open question. But if EU has the leadership role, I would say at all given points in time, it's important to stop, look back, and see how many are following. And I believe at the current stage now, there's quite a lot of challenges, and EU has carbon emissions representing about 7%. And I think when you stop up and look back, you would also get into the question of ambition. I would say for business, of course, climate is both an opportunity. There's lots of opportunities here in clean tech. There's also a lot of challenges, and you can currently see our industry is in a third year of actual downturn, and there was also a question about CBAM, and I see quite a lot of pushback when it comes from the global south regarding CBAM. We're big supporters of the EU ETS. We believe using a cap and trade system is the best way to achieve carbon neutrality, because you open up for different kind of solutions. You don't pick one technology in specific. So that is very good, but if you have very high ambitions in the ETS, it translates also into higher price for CBAM for those who export to the EU. So I believe when we look back who's following, when we look at the ambition level, even if we're en route towards carbon neutrality, I would question parts of the very ambitious EU ETS 1 target of becoming carbon neutral 2039. That would indeed then translate into lower CBAM price for those from the global south exporting to the EU. I believe it's an important question to at least ask. But then when it comes to the opportunities, apart from creating the right framework here by legislators, I also see that there's so many opportunities that are not taking. When it comes to energy efficiency, I believe there's a huge agency problem. If you take a house, for example, often it's very beneficial. You have energy efficiency potential, which are much higher than getting 10 or 20% back on your investment. They still don't materialize. Why? Because you have a different tenant and maybe ownership of the building. It's a very metaphorical example as well. I think that can be used for many of the initiatives that don't take place, that would not need any legislation. It's just a good business case. If you get the money, into doing that investment, you get back so much more than many of the other investments out there. So people need to see that. You need to have the right regulatory framework for that. So keep on looking for those opportunities. And I think the future is bright when it comes to climate policy. That's sort of my comment. And I understand, was I supposed to ask a direct question? I took it more as an intervention and a comment on the panelists. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Daniel. Turning directly to Benedict as well, and then we'll group the two interventions together, and I'll throw it back to the panel afterwards.
Yes, thank you very much, and congratulations to the organizers and speakers for this insightful discussion. So I'm Benedict Wallace. I'm representing OCP NutriCrops, part of OCP Group, the world's largest supplier of phosphate-based fertilizers. Our mission is to help feed a growing population sustainably, that is providing solutions that support yield production without compromising on climate and environmental goals. And I heard in the conversation that climate is not only about reducing emissions, and we fully abide by this principle. It's about building systems that are resilient. And the recent G20 Food Security Task Force declaration reminded us that despite global food production being sufficient, access remains uneven and malnutrition persists. Therefore, climate ambition and food security must not be seen as opposing goals, and climate and food policies must be coordinated. We need sustainable production that ensures affordability, nutrition, and resilience. And that means promoting efficient use of resources, reducing emissions, indeed, and building adaptation capacity in farming communities. And the OCP vision addresses environmental footprint reduction along the whole value chain of fertilization, from upstream to downstream. We've committed a $13 billion investment plan over 2023 and 2027 to accelerate the deployment of green technologies and decarbonization initiatives, anchored in measurable objectives, carbon neutrality over all three scopes by 2040, and 100% target of renewable energy across all industrial operations by 2027. A few remarks building on the remarks that have been made in the discussion. Resilience and food security are also important to address in a more fragmented and fragmented geopolitical context. And in this respect, collaboration and partnerships are crucial. And food sovereignty, which is a popular subject in the EU, is not about autonomy. It's about building bridges. And achieving real transformation requires industry to be fully involved, not as an observer, but as a driver of innovation at scale. And indeed, climate goals can provide an incentive for businesses and can be an incentive for innovation as well. The governments and multilateral partners should work with industry to design incentive-based mechanisms that reward farmers and industrial players by adopting sustainable and efficient practices. And by linking sustainability to economic opportunity, we can accelerate adoption, enhance resilience, and make green transitions inclusive for all businesses, smallholders, agribusinesses, industrial players alike. And as the EU's leadership is crucial, it must be cooperative, inclusive, and partnership-driven. And through initiatives like the Global Gateway, the EU can foster joint investment platforms, sustainable industry transitions, and regional innovation partnerships, particularly with Africa. And as an African company operating globally, we collaborate locally with farmers and stakeholders to promote sustainable farming practices. My question to the panel is, how can the EU and the G20 collaborate to foster multi-stakeholder partnerships and design and implement incentive-based mechanisms that accelerate the global climate transition, including in agriculture?
Thank you both, Benedict and Daniel, for these comments. Indeed, you both touched on the role of climate goals and targets as incentives for business, but then we also heard some concerns related to competitiveness and related to kind of the position of European companies about the importance of the EU climate agenda if other countries don't follow or are perceived as not following. So I wanted to throw this back to the panel, either Céline or Vidisha or anyone who feels like they want to jump in on this. How important is it that the EU's climate agenda in these multilateral forums, and is it and also how the EU and the G20 can collaborate to foster these multi-stakeholder partnerships, which Benedict mentioned. Yeah, Ursula, I saw you had your hand up, so maybe you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I suppose I just wanted to comment a bit on the sort of broader question of what kind of climate ambition and business and competitiveness. I mean, the European Council the other week, it said climate change is an existential threat, and it said we must ensure that it works together with competitiveness to build resilience for our economies. And I think this is absolutely the case, right? And I work with a lot of businesses that really see an EU directionality on climate as critical to their next investment decisions, because fundamentally, even to 2040 and 2050, we are very close to these investment decisions for many businesses. But in the short term, there are lots of things we need to solve and a lot of investment that we need to unlock in driving clean tech, dealing with many issues in the policies and considering how indeed we work in global fora and with global partners to deliver on this. I do think this kind of positioning of the EU is doing things and others are not, I don't think is true. We are behind on many things, right? We are way behind China, behind India on certain things, behind Indonesia on electric cars, I heard the other day. Maybe I've got the wrong country, but just as to illustrate, if we are to compete as Europe, we need to be going forward on global clean technology and giving the right signals to businesses, the right signals in general, in order to achieve that. And I think many countries are moving ahead much faster than us. And I think, interestingly, for South Africa, for example, I don't think it needs to wait on the EU for investment particularly. It has a lot of interest from China, from the Gulf, in terms of investment, in terms of, you know, really where the money may come from. And so for now, for the EU, this should really be about how we can strategically partner in a useful way, both for us and for South Africa or for African countries, for example, and think about it in a really kind of, as we work together to really build capacity globally, to build skills, to work out how we all advance and build global equity as well. So just reacting a little bit to the framing earlier, but yeah.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Indeed, it's a framing that is more and more prevalent in Brussels, I would say, and elsewhere as well. So it's interesting to discuss it and challenge it when necessary. And Céline, you also had your hand up.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just a couple of reactions to the discussion. Yeah, I fully agree. The continuity in the direction that is provided in terms of the long-term objectives, you know, at the EU level is super important, and we all know that. And it helps to anchor investments and, you know, expectations and so on. And it's not only super important for the climate agenda, but it's important for the competitiveness agenda of the EU as well. And some of the uncertainty around some of the, you know, kind of objectives set in terms of decarbonization is actually affecting the credibility of the EU. And I think we all know that there is a difficult, you know, kind of dynamics to manage across member states and so on. And I think we are all aware of that. I do think that the question on the multi-stakeholder partnerships is a very important one, an interesting one. The G20 has an interesting setup with a lot of engagement groups, as you probably know, around, you know, a lot of different interests and a lot of different groups that are a good way for the G20 to capitalize on that knowledge. One of the key question is, of course, is there too many engagement groups, and is the G20 able to capitalize really on, you know, the wealth of expertise and information that is provided? Sometimes we're not completely sure the importance that is given to this engagement group. But one of the recommendation that we gave as the T20, just so that you know, on this issue of insurance assurability and addressing the insurance gaps related to natural catastrophes and so on, was to actually foster the engagement and maybe to have a specific engagement group with the insurance communities. So not only, you know, the international assurance supervisors, which is kind of international forum working on that, but also some of the companies that are involved, because this is probably one of the area where more needs to be discussed. I saw there was as well in the chat a question on what is the dynamics between the G20 and the COP30. Just to answer very quickly to that, I mean, in the past, the G20 has played an important role in terms of sending signals and engagement, in particular on mitigation, ahead of the Paris Agreement, for example. I do think it's going to be challenging this year, because first it comes, you know, very late, but then the momentum, and I'd be very happy to hear Daniel on that, because I'm not completely sure momentum for a strong signal to the COP30 has been building up as part of the G20.
Daniel, please do come in.
Yeah, thank you. Just to react very quickly on what Céline just said. Indeed, in the past, the G20 had, as I said earlier, I mean, there was a sequencing in the year between the G7 earlier in the year, and then there was a G20, and very often the G20 summit was just ahead of COP, or in the first week of COP, gave a political signal to the negotiations for the COP itself. This year, this is the timing has been completely changed, also because there were elections in Canada, because of the election in the US. And now the summit comes very late after the COP, in fact. So indeed, this year I don't see that dynamic happening, and also because it was very clear from the beginning that the US would redline all the references to climate in whatever form or format, including very indirect ones. So it's clear that this year we will not have a consensus on climate in the G20, simply because the US is at the table, in the same vein as we didn't have one in the G7 last week on environment and climate and energy ministerial, because the US, of course, these are forums that are organized by consensus. So as long as one of the members around the table does not agree, we will not have a political consensus on climate until there is the US at the table. But that's everybody knows that, so we don't expect it. But what I was trying to say in my intervention is that the word climate or the word renewables is taboo for the US, and they don't accept that there is a climate change. When you have a president saying it's a hoax, of course it's a bad start. But the reality is that there is the rest of the world is aligned on that. And as I was saying in my intervention, is a question of necessity. The most obvious, of course, is adaptation, extreme weather events, and resilience. These are because we know the climate is changing and we need investment. So this is an area where we can still work together around the table and gather some consensus. And I think that will be the case also next year with the US presidency. There are conversations, including in the G7, which will continue on extreme weather events and on resilience. The second aspect is on mitigation, without saying mitigation, but there is a global race to clean technologies, and this is happening regardless of the political landscape. And this global race to clean technology or to renewables will continue to happen as well, regardless. But this conversation happened also because there is a business case for it, and we have to build a business case in Europe, and the rest of the world is building a business case. Also because the cost of technologies are plummeting, and also because it makes simply sense. So this, to bring it back to the G20, because I think we should focus on the conversation of what can we do to project that internationally. I think the G20 will remain a very valid forum to discuss these policy areas. How can we promote clean technology? Can we give a political signal as the G20 leaders, as the major economy leaders? Can we give a signal to the industry that we will stay the course on that, without necessarily mentioning climate, because this will be redlined by the US, but can we still give, nevertheless, a political signal that clean technologies is a business case, it makes economic sense, and as the South African presidency has presented it, is also a development factor. And the task force that Céline mentioned earlier on green industrialization, or whatever it will be called, and on critical minerals, gives a political signal that we need, or there is an economic narrative, a development narrative to pursue this path. And together with that, of course, there is the conversation about finance and the provision of finance and the mobilization of the finance needed for the most vulnerable countries, but also, of course, the mobilization of private finance and the de-risking and the alignment of all finance flows. So this kind of conversation, I think, need to continue and will continue in the G20. And I stop that, but of course, I'm happy. I could speak for hours on that.
Thank you so much. Before we go to the questions from the online audience, I wanted to come back on a point that was kind of hinted at different answers about there being a global race to clean technologies and renewables, access to finance, all of these things. And we spoke as well in Philani's intervention about the geopolitical tension that South Africa is finding itself, or not the tension, but the geopolitical situation that South Africa is finding itself in its relations towards the US. So I wanted to ask or address the other geopolitical elephant in the room, which is China. And I wanted to ask if, given China's significant influence in the G20 and also its relationships to emerging economies and countries in the global South, how is and has China positioned itself on climate finance and technology transfers in the lead up to the summit and in the different engagement programs that are connected to the G20? I don't know if anyone has had any direct experience or has any points they would like to raise directly on this, but I think it's another point on a list of many that we can address and discuss in this context. Yes, Daniel, go ahead.
And so I don't want to monopolize the floor, but I can just, as a feedback from the conversation we had in the environment and climate group, but also in the other groups where this issue was raised, I can say that where China is a major player in clean technologies, but because the G20, we have a bit to go beyond the triangle between Europe, US, and China. And the G20 allows precisely to have a broader conversation. And I think we have to go beyond this dichotomy between US and China and us and reach out. And that's where the G20 brings value, is reach out to other, and in particular to Africa. The African Union now is in the G20, in the South America with Brazil and India and Indonesia. So there are other players, and Australia, of course, and there are other players that go beyond what we from Brussels have maybe too much tendency to look only at China. China is, of course, a major player, and China is a clean technology superpower. But we have to go beyond that, and we have to see the broader picture and make partnership alliances with other countries. That doesn't mean we go against China. That doesn't mean we have to ignore China or withdraw. Quite the opposite. We have continued to working together with China, but we have to look at the broader picture, and that's what the G20 allows to do, and having a broader picture on the conversation.
Thank you very much. I don't know if anyone else wants to follow up on Daniel's point about the opportunities that the G20 presents for these kinds of cooperation that go beyond the triptych that we sometimes look at from Brussels as the only players that are relevant from the narrow Brussels perspective. If anyone has any additional points that they would like to emphasize or raise with regards to that. Yes, Vidisha, go ahead.
Thanks, Anna. First of all, completely agree with all of the points that Daniel made. From my the G20 context, there's two separate things that I can observe. So one is, of course, even within the G20, all of these countries do not agree with each other on every topic. So, you know, one format of going forward is really trying to make peace with the divergences that do exist within the G20. As far as China is concerned, and perhaps Céline and Philani might have other experiences, but in my experiences, their engagement within, whether that's the Chinese Sherpa, and their engagement within the G20 process, or their engagement within different engagement groups and task forces, has been rather limited. So that is an interesting observation, because overall China is a green tech superpower, as Daniel mentioned, and they have at the recent UN General Assembly made pretty ambitious commitments as well in terms of the climate and energy space. Given the leadership deficit that we talk about with what's happening in the US, we do have to recognize that China will look to play a broader role, specifically in terms of its engagement with emerging economies and middle powers, as we like to call them. So it will be interesting to see how the rest of the G20 countries and the platform itself navigates that dynamic. We realize that it is a complicated relationship, but it is one that we have to think about very carefully.
Just a quick one. Just note that some of the high-level delegates, when they arrive in South Africa, will be driven in Chinese cars. So just a quick one on that. But of course, I think also on the financing side, China is also trying to position itself, especially within the global South, is in the area of financing. So the whole discussions around multilateral development banks, you know, China is obviously, you know, sort of trying to position itself as a viable alternative, you know, to countries within the global South. There was mentioned earlier today of the global gateway, of course, and of course we know that China has been pushing heavily within the Belt and Road Initiative. On the African side, within the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, there's quite a bit that's set aside there around, you know, climate finance, or at least building of resilient infrastructure. So that's where sort of China is also trying to position, not necessarily always within the frameworks of the G20, but also, you know, even outside of the parameters of the G20. But I thought, let me make that point that many of the high-level delegates arriving in South Africa will be driven and chauffeured in Chinese cars. And that's obviously part of China's donation to the South African presidency.
Super interesting points from everybody on this topic. I thought we could move to some questions that we received from the online audience. The first one is addressed directly to Céline and other panelists who mentioned the reform of MDBs. So what major reforms are you advocating for, and what can you report on in terms of progress on this?
Yeah, thank you very much. I can start from, what I've witnessed, but please, Daniel, or others, if you have newer information or more information, would be very helpful as well. So this, MDB kind of reform path in the G20 has been going on for some time. Brazil has been a strong advocate of that particular kind of discussion. Moving on several fronts, the discussion, the MDB roadmap itself, the development of country platforms and so on, that are all collateral discussions that are either related to climate or more or broader, just on country platform. My understanding is that the COP30 will be an opportunity to announce a number of launches of country platforms. So there's a continuity here between the G20 and the COP. On the MDB roadmap itself, my understanding is that this year was the year where the KPI or monitoring indicators were being discussed. What's coming out of that, I don't know yet, and but I hope there will be something that will come out of it. My understanding as well is that the work on MDBs working as a system, how to promote accessibility and integration of MDBs and vertical funds, that was started under the Brazilian presidency with an expert report led by José Tanaka, was followed up this year by another expert report that was led by CPI, that is proposing some recommendations in terms of the interoperability of the administration of different MDBs, including mutual recognition of some of the administrative prerequisites. So it's a very technical agenda that I think is moving year on year. It's very incremental, but I think it can still make a difference. And it's very much around how those MDBs can work better together to increase or improve the accessibility of the funds. There's an underlying discussion as well that is a bit more difficult to handle, which is about the vertical funds and whether some of them should, because they're very fragmented, should be combined. And I think that's a more difficult discussion to have. That's my understanding.
Yes, Ursula, please go ahead.
So maybe just more directly on what we'd be looking for from the multilateral development banks. I mean, it is in general a shift from, let's say, crisis spending to really investing in infrastructure and investments to shift the green transition. And the B20 input in the finance and infrastructure paper came up with some thoughts around the role of blended finance and de-risking. So how specifically should this be brought into play? For example, how we bring concessional capital, so that means low interest loans, grants or guarantees from development banks, alongside commercial capital from institutional investors and banks to de-risk projects. So this means, how do we absorb the early stage losses, provide political risk insurance, or offer credit enhancements that improve bankability? It is pretty underused. I mean, we don't yet see much in terms of robust project preparation facilities that can help make sure that you turn an idea into an investment grade proposal. So we really are calling, or rather the B20 really called for scaling up the facilities, in expanding the global infrastructure facility and strengthening regional development banks to provide technical assistance. And also separately, CISL has also written a review of best practice in blended finance, which looks at what is what are the perceptions and misunderstandings holding this back, and how do we really put together these country platforms that can align donor funding, public budgets, private investors, and project pipelines, and really come together in a proper national plan. So I think that's important to see. And if you look at the sort of amounts of finance we're looking at, if we really want to achieve many of the goals of the Paris Agreement, we are seeing a need for the MDBs to mobilize an additional 2 to 4 trillion US dollars per year in clean energy investments alone. So there is a huge task ahead, and I think there could be a number of different ways to tackle this, but just some thoughts from the B20 paper on that.
Thank you very much. Another question was also directly addressed to Daniel or Philani as well. So with the current geopolitical tensions, could a forum such as the G20 offer some hope for advancing negotiations or collaboration between the biggest polluters within a smaller group of negotiators, compared to, for instance, the COP30? Or on the contrary, will the differences in interest be even more pronounced in a smaller setting? So more about the decision-making processes and the format of the forum itself.
Yeah, maybe just a quick one from my side. I think the format lends itself to I think creating at least the space and the opportunity where they are able to at least find each other and you know, without because I mean it's I mean the space itself, you know, for negotiation. I mean the G20, it's not like, I mean, as it goes from presidency to presidency, I think the fact that you have all these various working groups, you have all these even at a non-state level, I think that that format is actually well suited to the kind of discussions that we are having. And that's why I think even though we have, you know, there is worry about what will happen when the US takes over, of course, it's going to be a more limited, let's say, agenda. But all of these topics, I think, you know, the previous speakers made a good case that some of these topics, even if the US has issues with the framing of certain things, but the US is engaged in them. You know, the US private sector also doesn't want to be left behind when it comes to technology, when it comes to even, you know, clean technology. They don't want to be left behind. So I think it does create a space where you can move towards some degree of consensus. At times, it may mean watering down, you know, certain language, but I think it still keeps the issue, you know, on the agenda. And that might actually be well suited to then going into fora such as COP. It may not always work, you know, seamlessly like that. But I think when you add a forum like the G20, then you better understand where the different interests or the different pressure points of the different countries are. And therefore, once you go into fora such as COP, I think it actually eases rather than, you know, rather than being a hindrance to some of those negotiations, you know, taking place. I mean, we see it even with the geopolitical tensions. Right now, the bilateral relationship between the US and South Africa is not really that great, but engagement continues within the G20, within the G20 space. So, you know, the tensions don't spill over to such a point that you actually hinder the functioning, you know, even of the G20 as a mechanism. So I think I tend to look at it in a more positive. I think we do need, in a geopolitically divided landscape, you do need informal, you know, fora where countries can actually thresh out, you know, their issues.
Yeah, thank you. Daniel, would you agree?
Absolutely. There was, I think it's, first of all, we had a Korean cause, Philani, not Chinese, but no, I fully agree. If the format in itself, by consensus, and a format where we have engagement with all these engagement groups that feed into the conversation are also very important. The B20, the L20, the T20, all these groups and the Youth 20, everybody here has a word in the chapter. And I think this is where the inclusiveness of the process is. As you know, for European Union, we have a very inclusive process also in our trade agreements. This is something we are very fond of, having a conversation, not just between policymakers, but with the whole range of stakeholders. And that's, I think, unique. And of course, there are divisions. Sometimes the conversations are a bit more complicated because there are national interests. But in the end, as I said earlier, I think the fact that we are facing climate change and we have to address sustainability, and all the countries have to, because it's a matter of good governance, whatever your political color. This kind of format by working in consensus is probably a good signal to ahead of COPs or ahead of other multilateral negotiations, to give a signal that we are 75% of emissions. We are the biggest polluters, but we also have 80% of the population and 80% of the GDP. That means that not just we are the biggest polluters, but also we have the capacity to do something and to have an impact on the world. And I think this is the essence of the G20. We are responsible, and we have actors to make a change on the rest of the planet.
Thank you for that rather positive note. I think that's also a good place to end our discussion today, unfortunately, because there are a lot of interesting points that have been raised. And I think, as Daniel was saying earlier, we could talk about this for hours. But I want to extend a warm thank you to all of our panelists for joining us online today. It's really been great to hear the different perspectives and the different points that have been raised. And indeed, at least I leave this panel remaining hopeful about the role and the importance of forums such as the G20 and these multilateral consensus-based forums for global both climate action and decision-making. I also want to say thank you to Connecting Europe here at the EPC, who's been very helpful and instrumental in organizing this panel, and as well to all of the audience and the ones that are still with us after an hour and a half for your interesting questions. It's been a great discussion, and thank you all, and I wish you a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.